Well, hello everyone. Good evening. Welcome to another Berlage keynote lecture, which lands within the happening of our design masterclass entitled Unfinished Building, led by Divik Kallen. In this masterclass, participants are exploring building proposals of unfinished and adaptable nature by making large, crude timber models. It started this last Monday and will conclude with a public event and exhibition next Friday, November 17 in the afternoon here in the Orange Room, so we extend an invitation to all of you to join us then. And due to the fact that, well, Divik Kallen have already given a lecture with us recently, we decided to extend an invitation to Fabrizio Ballabio, who has collaborated with them in a recent publication about a house here in the Netherlands, and I believe will be part of tonight's lecture. Fabrizio is an architect and educator based in Milan. He studied architecture in Switzerland at the Academy of Architecture in Mendrisio and received his master's in history and theory at the Architectural Association in London. In 2023, Ballabio earned his PhD in history of art at the University of York with a research focusing on the relation of architecture and political reform in 18th century Naples. He is an editor and founding member of the Italian journal Stoa, and teaches design in Mendrisio in the chair of Curves and Gears. Between 2014 and 2018, Ballabio was a founding member of the art collective AIR, and since 2022 he runs the collaborative spatial practice BB with Alessandro Bava. So thank you, Fabrizio, and we look forward to the lecture.
Can you hear me? Yes. Great. I bring the water. Okay. So thanks, Juan, for the introduction, and thank you to the Berlage for inviting me to present some of my work. So the lecture is called Loose Frames, which is a title inspired, in a sense, by a project, in fact, by David Callen, which I will be mentioning later, and of which I collaborated on a publication. I suspect that's also why I'm invited here in the first place. It's a title which refers to the architecture of the house. Many of you, I think, know it already if you've attended David Callen's lecture before. And perhaps, let's say, more generally refers to, let's say, the set of relations which was developed in the design and construction of the house even. Loose frame comes from loose framing, which is actually a cinematic technique here in the famous Parasite movie, but by 2019, where essentially, which consists essentially of let's say, framing a scene very broadly to allow the actor to have a certain degree of movement, no, in traveling throughout the scene. In the context of this talk, I also interpreted it as a way of, let's say, exploring or presenting for the first time, I guess, a number of different facets of my own practice, which are extremely diverse and perhaps at times even contradictory between one another. So I will show you a few things that I do nowadays, which hopefully, let's say, together will give some degree of consistency. As Juan was suggesting, I have a background in research in the history of art and architecture and publish essays and books on the matter, studying, you know, the history of architecture from the Renaissance onto the 20th century. I teach at the Academy of Architecture in Mendrisio in the chair of Kersengers, and run I'm a co-founder and co-editor of the journal STOA, which is a journal focusing on architectural design pedagogy, so the teaching of the architectural project. I have a practice in Milan, which I run with Alessandro Bava, which consists of a kind of architecture studio, as well as a gallery. So we run an art gallery, which represents a set of artists and, you know, does everything a conventional art gallery is expected to do in the same space in Milan, nearby the central station. So today I present, let's say, a selection of projects which belong to these different realms. They are a book, a brief, so an exercise we did with our students, and a work which results from my collaboration with Alessandro as part of BB. Now, since the invitation to lecture here occurred in the context of this masterclass, which is dedicated to the theme of the unfinished and the relation between architecture and time, I thought it would be interesting to select projects which, in some degree, let's say, approach this issue in a non-conventional way. So I will be presenting these three works, so these three projects, in a sense, which deal with time in a synchronic way, in a diachronic way, and in a cyclical way. This is all in opposition to a conventional understanding of how time performs in architecture, which I guess we could say we inherited from the Renaissance as a linear sort of passage through stages. So the first project I'll start with is a book, in fact, and it's a book I developed recently with David Callen. It's part of the series called In Practice. I'm sure you may have seen, some of you may have seen at least photographs of it online, if not in person. It's part of a series of books which are called In Practice, which, let's say, gathers the work of a set of offices interested in, let's say, the practice of architecture as a certain theoretical sort of work. So as something which is not distinct nor secondary to theory, but as a way of making theory through indeed kind of the processes which are involved or which belong to making architecture itself. They are very interesting books which often, let's say, expose the genealogy of projects, starting from site visits down to the way individual practices carry out their designs, down to, let's say, iterative developments of projects up until construction. With images of a construction site, technical drawings, an outlook on the relationship between architects and builders, and so forth. Subjects which have, by the way, all been very dear to me also in my personal research. So Max and Chris contacted me in 2021, I think, to partake in this kind of project together. And we had known each other for a while. We're friends for, I guess, around 10 years, and taught together at the AA in the first year for 4 or 5 years at least. So naturally, I was very enthusiastic to kind of rekindle with them and work on this project together. Although the project kind of, in this specific iteration Max and Chris proposed, had a number of tricky points. Generally, it's not unusual for me to collaborate with fellow architects in writing projects, in documentation projects, and in book projects. I'm working now on a book which will be published soon with the Milanese-based practice Ganco, which is essentially, yes, the documentation of one of their large office remodeling projects in Milan, focusing on the relation between building and image. It's a collaboration with the photographer Louis de Belle. I write often for Italian journals such as Casabella or Domus, doing criticism of architecture. This is a case, an article I wrote for a house in Brazil by a practice called Atelier Branco. But let's say the commission or the proposal Chris and Max had made to me was substantially different from all these experiences I had undertaken in the past. First of all, the building was on site, and the book was scheduled to be published before the building would be completed, which is an extremely paradoxical sort of situation for a writer, in that you're not writing about a project, you're not writing about a finished building, but you're writing about something which is in a state of transition, so an unstable object. On top of that, the project Chris and Max were developing for Villaruba, which was the subject of the book, was in itself designed to be able to withstand a large degree of change during the design and construction process. And in fact, the two were almost occurred in contemporary with one another. So it was a scenario which defied, let's say, conventional understandings of, let's say, project timelines. Whereas usually you have, architecture projects are kind of divided in compartmentalized phases where you have design, construction, documentation, and perhaps at the end writing, so the work of the critic. In this case, the different activities occurred concurrently with one another, and in fact the writing was the one that would stop first. So that was a kind of already an interesting dilemma to deal with when thinking about the nature of the object we would be writing about. On the other hand, there was a problem of a commission, or an interesting question about a commission where we were asked to develop a text which was the result of a collaboration between myself and the architects, let's say, who developed the project. And this posed the difficult question of the relation between the architect and the scholar, or the architect and the critic. This is a scan of Rainer Banham's famous article on the new brutalism, where he opens with a line which was very significant for me, which says, introduce any external observer in a field of forces and that field becomes distorted. So there was a question, obviously, of what my role would be in kind of in participating in the narration of the process of this house, and to what extent, let's say, my own contribution could betray, let's say, a sincere sort of tale of what this house was about, somehow. The second problem was the problem which has to do with the problem of sources. So generally, as a researcher, when you work on certain projects, you have an idea that a project is concluded and there are a certain set of somehow documents you can consult, most kind of printed, some digitized, of course, nowadays. But in the case of this project, the archive or the sources were in flux as the project developed. And since Divikalen is a networked practice, they were essentially exclusively digital for me, and well, let's say were taking place within platforms which were essentially consultable only online. So I'll show you a bit how we went about with navigating, or how I went about with navigating, you know, through making an understanding of this project, which involved, let's say, having a set of folders with documents I could travel through, including, let's say, observations or documents relating to the site, to drawings which were made by the clients, for example, in anticipation of the project, while developing a brief together with Divikalen, towards iterative drawings which Divikalen made in the design of the project, to models, to documentation of the construction site. And this was the state the house was in when I started writing about it in collaboration with them, to let's say exchanges between the architects and the clients over phone calls, exchanges between the architects and the builders somehow. So an extreme wealth of material, mostly raw, so unprocessed, which in some measure collaboratively we had to make sense of in order to tell a story somehow of how a work comes into being. A way we we went about with navigating through this material was to begin with to develop a questionnaire somehow. So I prepared a set of questions extensively, kind of asking them to write about aspects of the house concerning, I don't know, their feelings about the site, how the brief was, and there were constant back and forth with them in telephone calls, or let's say with discrete notes which were made to explain certain elements. And after that, somehow the editing process came about, and the question was how we would structure this material. Now, it's a very interesting book because in some measure it kind of stretched my understanding of what, let's say, the role of a writer is in not just in kind of reacting towards a piece of work which is finished, but in some measure completing even a piece of work as a kind of integral part of what making architecture is about. And it's an especially interesting book because I think one decision we took was to write it entirely in the first person. So while in fact I was kind of one of the persons, let's say, which was mostly in charge of writing the text, it is all written as an explanation, let's say, on behalf of the architects. So there is this interesting fiction of who the voice is, let's say, in the text, which, you know, I think is a generally interesting topic when it comes to researching and to writing about architecture. So the text is called In Progress, and of course, let's say, documents, let's say, the documents the house as it is being built. And in fact, the text itself is developed as the house is under construction. So it's somewhat of a hybrid between a kind of narration of a process, a journal of a process as it unfurls, and let's say an anticipation even, or a plan even of what is to be done in the next steps somehow. I show you some slides of the book where, for example, you can see, let's say, early developments of the house, but also extremely interesting materials which have to do, for example, with the to and fro which took place between the architects and the client. And I thought this was an extremely interesting component also in the context of the book, because just as, let's say, the voice, if you want, of the critic or the kind of writer and the architect began to be confused and jumbled, let's say, in revealing these documents themselves and in the narration of the book, there is a kind of a parallel somehow, let's say, exchange taking place between the architect and the client, where, in fact, let's say, what are usually presented as compartmentalized sort of roles in the making of the building start to be presented in a way which was much more complex, synchronic, and interlinked with one another. Mm. So the book deals extensively with the design process of the house. So it goes through all the early stages, through different types of mediums and the drawings which were made. It explains also, let's say, the way in which the design of the house itself, let's say, is informed by the peculiar process by which it is made. So a house which is able to retain a set of, let's say, of strong sort of principles which are capable of withstanding and taking on a substantial degree of change, both, let's say, in an expected kind of a future of the house, as well as in the process of construction, which was a very extended process, in fact, due to many reasons, including COVID, for example. So there are all sorts of documents which account for how this transformation took place. So, for example, let's say, in especially interesting in kind of in showing the relation between the development, let's say, of this kind of structuring main 9-square grid of rooms and the system of internal partitions, which, you know, on a kind of regular basis was transformed, changed, altered, depending on, let's say, the kind of different priorities architects and clients had at a certain moment. There are, of course, photographs of the construction site which are extremely interesting because they are not kind of the regular snapshots one would have of construction works, but in fact, let's say, are almost elevated to the state of documentation, which was something extremely interesting to ponder on and to think about while developing, let's say, an analysis of this work, and of course a wealth of material, including construction drawings and so forth. Now, the last part of the book, which is, I think, also one of the most interesting, includes the photographs of Antoine Espinassot, where you have this very, I think, interesting and eerie kind of juxtaposition of images which seem to present the house in a finished state and images which present the house still under construction, as if, let's say, the object is impossible to grasp in any definitive stage. So, you know, photographs which show the place inhabited, photographs which show the place as it's still in a phase of transition. And the key, in a way, to understanding, let's say, this idiosyncrasy is then the text Chris and Max wrote at the very end of it, which I understand is also the basis for the brief that was given to the students. So this was the first project. Now, the second project I present, in a way, is a brief we carried out with our students in Mendrisio, and has to do with diachronic time, where diachronic time is understood as something which concerns the way something develops over a certain period. So understanding, let's say, objects, which might include, I don't know, language, but also design or whatever, as something which is not static and is pictured in a singular time slot, but which is evolving. And this, of course, is, let's say, in architecture, it's a substantially, let's say, different way of understanding what the status of the architect in the design process of a building is compared to, let's say, standard practice. Now, it's called Everything because, in fact, our studio in Mendrisio is called Everything. It is run by Kirsten Gers, Yelena, Guido, and myself. We have it's a studio which does, of course, design work, which teaches architectural design. These are some of the booklets we make with the student work, which we carry out in our unit, but which is also engaged with research and which understands design and also, in fact, architectural design pedagogy as an instrument to produce research. So this is a book we published recently on Aldo and Lani Van Eyck with photographs of Bas Prinsen, or this is another book which documents a research on the production of culture in Brussels. So understanding, let's say, in culture as something which involves a broad ecology of practices. And this was, in a sense, a book which we developed in preparation for a large diploma project. So it was essentially a brief we gave to other studios to develop projects for Brussels. This is the exhibition we made at the end of the term with all the student work presented on screens at Maniera in Brussels early in the following year. So everything is called everything because, let's say, it tries in as much as possible to adopt a wide frame on what architecture is, and is a kind of container which involves very sort of idiosyncratic and contrasting topics, although all analyzed with a certain approach, a certain way of looking, a certain gaze. This is a tapestry by the Italian artist Alighiero Boetti, which is titled Tutto, so everything, which includes, in a sense, which appears to be, in a sense, a certain kind of white noise, no, where you kind of don't really understand what is going about, but which on closer look is, in fact, an accumulation of extremely discrete and sort of precise figures, which are, you know, juxtaposed to one another and create this kind of field condition. So in the studio, we deal with various topics. Some of the recent semesters include explorations on theoretical notions. This was, for example, the brief of a semester where we focused on Unger's notions of the large form to try to understand whether it had any relevance today while developing large projects on the margins of the city of Milan. So projects which, let's say, hinge between an urban condition and a territorial condition. There are semesters which, which are concerned with the work of a specific author, which we understand as relevant at a particular historical moment. So in the case of a modernist ending, which is a brief we developed last year, we were focusing on the work of the Italian architect Giancarlo De Carlo, and designed a set of complexes for his student college site in Urbino. So in a sense, expanding on it and kind of responding to the increasing demand for housing and understanding what a student campus is. There are briefs which are concerned with a particular place or city, as for example, a brief we developed for a diploma project in Milan called Milanogram, where the students started from a set of kind of unbuilt works for the city from the past, reimagining them, let's say, in a present situation. So re-elaborating them and starting from history or evidence or facts which already took place as a starting point to develop new projects for the city. Today I show you, let's say, more in detail one brief which was called The Cultural Imaginary of Production. It was a brief we did with our diploma students, and as all diploma briefs, in Mendrisio it takes place within a larger framework which is set by a diploma director. In this case, the diploma director was Frédéric Bonnet, who decided to work on a very peculiar site, which is the twin cities of Firminy and Saint-Étienne, and gave us this provocative title, Firminy Post-Utopia, an Architectural Fiction, without much explanation of what we should be doing there. So the city, or the twin cities somehow we were working on, presented an interesting condition. There were two sites which were extremely important for the industrialization of France, being the key areas where both the weapon industry and the silk sort of spinning industry took place, which in a sense created somehow the power of the nation, let's say through the 18th century and up until the early 1900s. It is also the place where Le Corbusier famously developed and partly built one of his large master plans, which was Firminy Vert, of which now only a few fragments somehow remained, and without, let's say, the broader idea of the plan. But essentially, what interested us was this kind of this double condition of a kind of dwindling reality of an industrial site, which was no longer active somehow, and on the unfulfilled promise, let's say, of a modernist master plan, which was never really, let's say, brought to completion. We decided to work with students on a set of specific topics, such as revisiting, let's say, the idea of the kind of industrial utopia as present in the work of certain kind of reformers from the 19th century, as well as early 20th century practitioners such as Leonidov, and imagine alternative sites of production to those which, let's say, dominated the last 100 or so years. And relevant to this presentation, what we asked students to do was to develop projects diachronically. So to imagine, to take into consideration not just the moment in which the building would be, the specific moment in which the building would be built, but how a certain project would behave over a time span of at least 60 years, which was, let's say, the time, the kind of time gap between, let's say, the last completed buildings of Le Corbusier and our semester working on Mendrisio. We took inspiration from this kind of set of works by Thomas Cole called The Course of Empire, where he depicts, let's say, or where he imagines somehow the rise and fall of a civilization in 5 paintings. And most specifically, in fact, we took interest in Ed Ruscha's sort of reinterpretation of that painting series, which are a series of if you want, fictive diptychs. So Ed Ruscha made a series of paintings in the early 90s, which focused on, let's say, industrial buildings in Los Angeles, and then decided to re-depict those buildings, basically almost 15 years later, in order to tell a story of how the city, let's say, was not just those buildings were changing, let's say, over the course of 15 years, but also the city and the character of the fabric and the type of society, let's say, which it was, let's say, catering to. So you have, for example, the diptych of the blue-collar tires building and the expansion of the old tires building now as a kind of, let's say, impermeable sort of office complex. The trade school, the blue-collar trade school, which becomes the old trade school building, now again understood as this kind of hyper sort of protective and heavily fenced, let's say, business headquarter. Perhaps one of the most poetic, the blue-collar telephone and the site of a former telephone booth, which talks about the disappearance of a certain phenomenon in the kind of material culture of a city, and, let's say, the reality which develops in its place. So we decided to use this method of the diptych, studying, let's say, a certain phenomenon or a certain building diachronically as a method of working with the students, which in fact, let's say, in developing the projects, we're always working with 2 stages in the life of their building. In some cases, this had to do, for example, with imagining a building which would change use over time, and let's say illustrating how that process would take place in the actual sort of design and redesign of a building. So this, for example, is a scenario of a textile factory which becomes a museum. In certain cases, it had to do with understanding buildings which, in fact, were open-ended systems that could develop or grow over time, as is the case in this project for a decentralized kind of textile district and silk spinning factory, which is developed with kind of components which can be, of course, let's say, configured in different ways according to a set of principles developed by the students. Studies of how entire sites, which, for example, in this specific case were places of a certain mode of energy production, could transition over time into becoming new places or new sort of centers for new modes of energy production, as well as understanding, for example, how the introduction of a certain building can impact on the development of the landscape which surrounds it. So the building as an agent of change in the very context it occupies, which is a similar scenario, for example, in these 2 projects. This one being for instance, a hybrid between a farm and a hospital. Now, the result were 12 projects scattered throughout, let's say, the territory spanning between these two cities and within the city itself also. And I'll just show you in more detail one of these projects, which is, not necessarily the best, but simply one which is interesting to present as a paradigm, which is a project for a growing optical factory in the city of Saint-Étienne. Just so you have a sense also of how our students work. So it's a vast triangular shed building in the center of the city, in an area which of course used to be marginal in the past, and deals in a way with let's say two phenomenons. One, an understanding of, or a reinterpretation of the industrial city where, let's say, production is no longer regarded as something which has to be removed from the urban fabric, but which actually can be integral to urban life and can be integrated, in fact, in urban life. So the idea of a porous factory somehow. And another one, of course, an interest in optics, which is a field which was forever, let's say, active in the site and which underwent, let's say, multiple iterations throughout the year. And there was also an existing tram depot on the site, which was, let's say, an extremely significant building in the city, in that it announced almost the entrance to the town, which could be integrated and, let's say, taken as a starting point for the project, precisely in the idea that these projects have no clear beginning and no clear end. So the students then developed timelines, for example, where here you no longer have scales, but in fact dates, and speculated on ways in which, let's say, a certain kind of institution could grow, and around it also the city surrounding it, in a kind of fictional way, which, however, let's say, I think is interesting in understanding the kind of complexity an architectural project can involve when it interacts with time and with place. In its final form, it's essentially a factory which is traversed through streets and which has compartments dedicated to education, compartments dedicated to production, compartments dedicated to display, namely in the top part, and compartments dedicated to transport, because the old kind of tram depot building is then replaced by a new one which is integrated in this building, which is in a sense part architecture, part city. And a set of volumes which stick out, which include, let's say, discrete activities which can't take place within the context of a large, vast horizontal building. Here's a set of images which are the kind of renders we make with our students, which are, in a sense, let's say, CGI-produced images, but with a kind of with a technique which, let's say, resembles rather painting and the making of perspectives. So, in a way, again, a kind of, let's say, achronical way of making images, which takes images from the past as a model, but uses new techniques for making them, and a set of sections and plans where the building can be understood better. So, for example, in this case, Valentina was starting the project with the old tram depot and speculating on how a reuse of the building could develop. That was in the earlier section of the building. And then her whole argument for, let's say, the development of the building around this section started from the premise of making variations on the type of the shed building, which, depending on the span, would also change in structure, but always through a kind of coherent language of design. Now, I show you some of these slides, which are what we call the dossier, which is a part usually we have our students insert in the presentation, which speak a bit about kind of the argument and the method, where we asked all the students to work with timelines and to try to really kind of investigate, let's say, the different components of the history of place and of the city, and understand their building as an agent in these processes in flux and speculate on how the introduction of a building in a certain place can warp, change history, change, let's say, the way certain phenomena occur through time. So it's really about using time as an active agent in design as opposed to simply, let's say, a fact. These are other diagrams which illustrate, let's say, the impact of the building in relation to other, let's say, related industrial clusters, illustrations which, let's say, account for, let's say, before and after scenarios of how the building works as an institution, and detailed drawings which, you know, involve both kind of technical drawings of buildings produced in the present, as well as speculations for reusing buildings from the past, and even reusing one's own building somehow. So it's an extremely convoluted and spiral-like process where you are asked to design a work and then reinterpret your work, relive your work, retransform your work. And voila, this was the outcome, or the final diptych, which showed this transformation of place through a single project. Now, the last work I show deals with cyclical time, and its title is Plot. And by cyclical time, I guess what I mean is a time which is not defined by linear progress, but by loops somehow, in which beginnings and ends tend to coincide or confuse themselves, or where in fact nothing ever started and nothing ever began. It's a project which, as I said, I developed as part of the practice Bibi, which I run with Alessandro Bava. We have an office in Milan, and given our background in the arts, as part of an art collective, we mostly work on projects, let's say, which happen in cultural contexts. So, for example, exhibition design, scenography. So this is a work currently at the Italian Pavilion at the Biennale, which was the backdrop for a concert we did in a natural reserve in southern Italy, where we asked a set of performers, amongst which the historian of music, Walter Maioli, to perform ancient classical music through seashells and other kind of nature-born instruments. And we also, I guess, perform, or we also conduct a certain, let's say, more conventional kind of conventionally understood design work. So there's a master plan for an area nearby the cemetery of Brescia, and a pavilion we are developing to celebrate the harvesting of wine in Valdarno in Tuscany, so a sort of pagan temple on which we are collaborating with an artist called Feminelli, who is doing the ceramic tiles for it, still designing it. We also run a gallery space, which is in fact adjacent to our office, and which in a way is a kind of, how do you say, the backside of the coin of the office. So many times these two are not kind of independent sort of compartments, but often the artists, for example, we work with the gallery end up being the artists also we collaborate with or work with in the practice. This is a show we have on now and which closes tomorrow by Harry Sanderson. It's a work on optics. So the artist, let's say, was studying ways to encrypt memory in a physical form through simply sculpting the surface. So they're not engravings. They're studies on the curvature of glass and what behavior it has when you project light through it. So the project I show you now is a very small project, in fact, not necessarily even one of the most representative for us, but one we hold very dear, and which I think opens up to an interesting set of reflections on how, let's say, building and time engage with one another. And it's a project which is nested in another project. So Plot is an exhibition, a major exhibition by an artist called Asad Raza, American artist, in Bolzano, within which, let's say, a set of, let's say, other exhibitions are nested. So Azad, since 2019 in Sydney, has been working with a set of pieces called Absorption, which essentially consist of filling up rooms of museums and cultural institutions with earth and staging somehow a process of caring or maintaining, let's say, the fertility of this earth. It looks rather simple and dumb. It's a very, in fact, sophisticated process where he has scientists study the composition of soil, which often is regarded, in fact, as a portrait of place. So the soil is not just humus or simply, let's say, ground found around, but is a particular composition which the artist devises, which may include, yes, indeed, regular soil, but also, I don't know, coffee, human feces, tobacco, hair, and whatnot, depending on the particular site he's developing the project for. Throughout the duration of these exhibitions, he actually always hires a set of what he calls gardeners, which are there, let's say, for the whole opening hours of the museums or the sites he is in, and which are there to take care and fertilize and kind of measure sort of the physical values of the soil in order to guarantee that it stays alive. So it's a construction of an artificial kind of nature, which is maintained throughout periods which often last like, I don't know, 6 to 12 months even, and which, let's say, at the end of the process is then deconstructed and returned to nature in a kind of altered state. He calls this soil neo-soil, precisely because, of course, it's a creation. So the iteration of this project, which has had multiple versions already around the world, from Sydney to New York to Berlin and whatnot, but the iteration we were working on was in a museum in Bolzano, which is a city in the northeast of Italy, in the area of Tyrol. It's a peculiar museum, which in fact looks more like a bank headquarter or a corporate office than a museum, which I think made the introduction of this piece particularly eerie and interesting. And as with the previous iterations, the neo-soil here was a specific composition and had gardeners which would take care of the soil and kind of ensure that its fertility and liveliness remain intact throughout the duration of the whole exhibition. I guess differently from earlier incarnations of the projects, here Azad's idea was to invite a set of artists and architects to develop, let's say, to develop a set of interventions in the exhibition space. So he invited us, and we in turn invited Lydia Uramane, which is an artist from Algeria, to collaborate with us, and he invited also Mariah Evans, which is a choreographer from New York, to develop a performance in the site. So we invited Lydia in view of a collaboration we had already had with her a couple of years before, which had to do with a series of pictures she took documenting, let's say, mud brick constructions in the Algerian desert. So buildings in a state of decay, which were gradually being returned to nature. And understanding this process as an ancestral sort of practice, let's say, not just in the construction of dwelling, but also in the kind of symbolism of kind of a certain civilization. So here, for instance, you have the mud brick mold of it's at the British Museum now, which was used to construct the temple of Hatshepsut, which is this queen pharaoh of Egypt, which is there depicted, for example, in the bottom right, using this very utensil to make the kind of founding mud brick for the site. We thought this was an interesting sort of precedent to start thinking of what to do with this space, and decided that we would use this neo-soil to create construction material, which of course was easier said than done, because making adobe bricks requires a certain composition I mean, I'm not going to kind of enter into technicalities here since we're in the kind of technical university, and surely many people here know more than me about it. But it requires a certain composition of the soil, which includes clay, having clay, humus, and so forth. And we had to work instead with this highly idiosyncratic soil, which was given by the exhibition itself, going through the kind of impossible task of turning it into something which would become sturdy and solid. So the whole project became an exercise in designing, let's say, or in conceiving the constructions of these bricks as a temporal and as a spatial choreography, let's say it had to do with, let's say, the amount of labor we had at our disposal, the amount of time we had at our disposals, the amount of bricks we could develop, let's say, within the opening hours of the museums, and the resulting structure we could make with those bricks. Now, turning a museum into a brick factory is no simple feat, and it involves all kinds of administrative processes to be set in motion, and the likes. So in a way, we started to use spaces of the museum and design this kind of brick factory, which could produce the largest possible amount of bricks in the smallest possible amount of time. Considering also that this was a kind of climatized space, so it's not as if you were making bricks in the Moroccan desert where you can leave them under the sun for a week or 2 weeks or even 1 month, but everything had very short drying times and not in ideal conditions. So essentially, like throughout the duration of the show, we turned a space in the museum into a brick making factory and casted a bricklayer or a brick maker, which we called the dweller, in fact, which was in a way, let's say, a hybrid between a laborer and a performer, continuously, let's say, continuously fabricating or making bricks in this space, taking the soil from the exhibition, bringing it to the kind of brick manufacturing lab and turning it into bricks and so forth. So it involved designing and devising a set of frames, of which the design and the number and shape has to do with all these kind of complex elements, such as drying time, the amount of space we had to dry, and the amount of labor we had at our disposal. So for how many bricks the brick maker could make each day. Through these, let's say, making a whole set of tests for understanding, let's say, how these bricks could be made sturdy enough to be able to be piled up, and then the stacking somehow of these, or the devising of a set of, let's say, infrastructures for these things to be able to be stacked and dried, and eventually then brought to a storage before being, let's say, brought back to the space. So so in a way, the old library of the museums, we had all the books taken out, and it was entirely populated by this kind of brick making sort of endeavor, which, as you see here, started in a very kind of rudimentary way through many failures, and progressively then became more and more sophisticated and more precise as the project went on. Yeah, these, for example, are some screenshots from the notebook of Filippo, which was, of course, the dweller who would, let's say, day by day study the recipes and test the different kind of compositions of the soil as the project was made. There was also a biographical component where on each day, as if it were kind of the record of a kind of, or the diary, the brick making became kind of like a diary of a person who was astray because he was Venetian and kind of catapulted in Bolzano and being like, 8 hours a day in this place doing one activity, almost like indeed, like kind of like in exile. It included kind of notes which, let's say, introduced his personal life within the process. So when he had what would happen when he had bad sleep? What would happen on a good day? What would happen Yeah, well, on day 33, obviously abstraction. I guess his mind was starting to go to weird places. But here you see also the drying process now with the wet bricks being stacked on the dried bricks beneath. And this lasted for a period of 2 months, and I think around 2,800 bricks were made, which is surprisingly little if you calculate then the size of a structure you can make with them, but is a surprisingly let's say large quantity of individual sort of components a single individual can make in a given context. So in the end, the project or the product somehow became quite literally just a demonstration somehow of the capacity of or of demonstration of what you could make precisely with this whole kind of choreography, which lasted over 2 months and stood in the space as a kind of apparition for 2 weeks, in a way which is somewhat reminiscent of these kind of sepulchres, or kind of yeah, in this case it's a replica actually of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, but in Florence by Leonbattista Alberti, which is kind of a miniature house which sits in a larger space. It was in our case, an extremely simple kind of structure which had relatively small dimensions and a relatively, let's say, basic sort of basic, yeah, let's say geometry, and which was assembled without any joints or nothing. So just a stack of all the bricks which could be produced. It sat in the space for 2 weeks, and as it was there in the last 2 days, Moriah Evans is this choreographer from New York, which came to develop a set of performances, of which you can see some pictures here. And the performances had of course to do with, let's say, topics ranging from, broader considerations on ecology, the troubled relations which we as modern subjects have with the earth, the soil, and the nature. But it also developed into a performance which was like a ritual ceremony anticipating the destruction of this kind of sanctuary which developed in the space, and its eventual return to soil at the end of the process. So the whole thing was then kind of shattered into pieces and respread into the soil. And everything, let's say, went back to the initial state, which was in a way a kind of an ideal metaphor, for how let's say our relation with the planet as dwellers and builders could be in a kind of idealized state. So I stop here, and yeah, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk more about it.
Hello, Fabrizio. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you about the process of curating the artist or the architect that exhibit in the gallery, or maybe sometimes are included in your writings. If it has to do also, if it has a relation to your research work, or yeah, how do you do that curation process?
It does, in the sense that my partner and I were two individuals, and even though we are involved in things which have sometimes which exist in kind of separate spaces, they are still kind of all in our heads, and inevitably there are connections which take place. Although it is true that especially with the research. When I think over the years, having been someone who has had, let's say, 4 concurrent practices running at the same time, research, art making, architecture, teaching, and so forth, I developed a kind of antidote, which, to kind of entering in an existential crisis, which was to deal with each of them in an extremely narrow way. I think only now I am coming to terms with the fact that one can exist as an individual. Which has a kind of very broad horizon and a very broad, let's say, canvas on which to, let's say, produce cultural work. And only now I'm coming to terms with the fact that maybe many of these things can exist, let's say, in shared spaces. So when it comes to curation, I think with the gallery, it's how do you say, it's a very interesting topic, because as any art gallery, we work with a set of artists which are, let's say the artists we work with on a regular basis, which are artists which are represented by the gallery, so to say, and then have artists which we invite for occasional shows, mostly from abroad. But especially with the artists that we work with on a regular basis, I think with a gallery of our size and our age, because we've started the process, this project only 2 or 3 years ago, you realize how important place is in the sort of configuration of a certain program, and how, in fact, let's say, establishing a cultural site in a city and establishing a network of individuals which, you know, share a project and a space is, in fact, a way of constructing, let's say, a community or a certain, let's say, discourse through, let's say, social and kind of intellectual relations in the city. And this is something which I think the gallery allows for in ways that are, let's say, at least for this moment, because we're still relatively small and unbothered by economic factors. I don't know how it will be in the future. But it allows for constructing this, which are, in a way, much more pure and much more, let's say, unbiased than, for example, the work we do with the practice, where instead we often work even on commissions. So yeah, we're essentially, I mean, we're always involved in an extremely privileged world with people with, you know, multiple degrees and an extremely sophisticated and nuanced approach to designing and making space. But still, you know, we essentially work on commissions. With the gallery, instead, it allows us, the element of curation allows us really to embody, let's say, certain aspects of research in a place, in a community, in a group of people, which is extremely, I think, interesting and important, especially in our age, you know, where relations are much more networked and, let's say, international and so forth.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So my question is about the first project in practice. So at some point you explained that the process of doing it, it's like entering an expedition, like making a journal of a process. So I was wondering, how do you become the voice of a project? I mean, not a project, of a process of a project.
Yeah.
Like, how do you appropriate like all these material you collect, like in order to tell the story, and even more in a project that is not yours, like, and where is the line, like, of that appropriation? Because it feels like you appropriated, like, in a good way, because the result is really beautiful, of course. But yeah, that's like my question.
Yeah. No, I like the words you used. I don't know if I said expedition, but I certainly feel like that the attitude with many of these projects is the attitude I try to maintain always, is that of the adventure. So many of these projects and these collaborations or these practices don't take place because I have a kind of precise career path in mind that I want to follow, or because I have to tick a certain set of boxes which will allow me to have a certain, let's say, economical or social security, but really out of a spirit of kind of pure curiosity and the desire to, let's say, to enter domains which were perhaps unknown to me beforehand. And I think this book with Chris and Max was one such event. And of course, I could have dealt with it in a much easier way, just demanding that I have an independent text. And by the way, the book has also standalone texts by other, let's say, scholars or figures that we invited even. But I thought that as an experiment in writing and in criticism, I thought it would be useful or interesting for me once to test what happens if you confuse these voices, and what happens, let's say, or in a way, or to indulge in the pure pleasure of let's say, of speaking through someone else's voice. Of course, that comes with responsibilities, in the sense that, you know, a critic or a writer is a person who then is also, let's say, accountable for the kind of story she or he delivers. And in the specific case of this project, I think no kind of accurate or kind of truthful narration would have been possible in the first place. In fact, I think, you know, all projects are fictions, both in terms of their making and in terms of their kind of myth-making afterwards. So, in a way, I think that this process that we kind of went through in shaping this book was just an extreme version of how these things take place in normal situations somehow. I did try with this introductory text called The Observer to reveal, in a way, the plot as a kind of almost third voice, which you know, explains the play before the scene opens, the curtains are drawn open, and hopefully as people read it, you know, they will read the introduction and understand that it is as much somehow the kind of the tale of the coming into being of a house as it is an experiment somehow in storytelling and in storytelling in architecture.
So to me, it is quite incredible how you managed to do these things simultaneously. It's almost you exist yourself in the synchronic time, always with multiple things. So I'm interested to hear, how do you manage your own interests in this, across these various fields? Because the kind of expertise that you have in them, and also the results that come out, are quite impressive, but also the work is always in collaboration with very different agents and very different people. So maybe on this kind of very pragmatic notion of how do you manage your time, but also the idea of the interest, or this kind of path that you're trying to follow throughout an idea of a career.
Yeah. It's something that, I mean, here now the discussion becomes personal. The first thing is to have a very good analyst to talk to, in order to be able to make sense of why this takes place. But I think for a long time, let's say between my mid-20s and my mid-30s, I didn't necessarily question why and what I was doing, and why it was important to have a certain kind of openness, no, in terms of the horizon of the things which lay in front of me. And in fact, let's say there were years in which one of these activities was dominant. So, for example, if I probably had come here 2 years ago, I would probably have worn the hat of the historian who just completed a PhD in kind of late Baroque architecture in southern Italy, and presented, let's say, a reading of kind of government buildings in kind of monarchical Naples through a kind of I don't know, materialist frame. But as I said before, I think, let's say, the approach to all these things has been always, let's say, with the spirit of the adventurer. So I was always fine with them not. I was actually always happy of them not becoming permanent commitments, but let's say individual projects which, you know, which could begin and depending on my interest. Now, in terms of time management, yeah, what to say? I think I became I became certainly better at it in my later years, also as a result of fatherhood, I guess. But I think it has to do also with understanding. I mean, with approaching time not quantitatively but qualitatively. So let's say configuring your life and your work and pursuing things which allow you or which you feel confident you are able to do in let's say a time that is of value. So it's not necessarily doing the most amount of work one can do, but doing, let's say, the best one can do in a limited amount of space and time. I think it's. I mean, I talk to you. Many of you are young architects who just graduated, and there are always many expectations on how your careers will develop, how your life should be shaped, and many of these are conventional wisdom and come from societal structures which you simply conform to because you feel like one feels like they are the adequate thing to do. I mean, sometimes someone is lucky enough to simply be passionate of what one is doing and doesn't need to question that. But in my specific case, I have always had a very adversarial position with respect to structures and frames and frameworks within which which I was encountering as a young sort of architect, and with the expectation that knowledge is valuable only when it's kind of specialized, deeped, and channeled into one space. I found that always an especially problematic aspect of modernity, especially having studied, let's say, how certain fields of knowledge developed in the past, so before the 19th century. And perhaps, I don't know, in virtue of all the research that I did in early modern on the early modern period, I simply began to think it was. I mean, I think it is possible to have a certain degree of incoherence, of apparent incoherence, no, in how many things you work on stand together, which perhaps at some moment start to gain a kind of a more kind of identifiable profile. But I'm in the middle of it, so let's see.
In progress.
Well, thank you, Fabrizio. Last round of applause.
Thank you.